Okay, so here we are, starting again. Can everybody hear me here?
Yes, better.
Yes. Okay. So welcome to this event, Prospects for a Nuclear and Fossil-Free Future, bringing together activists that are here in New York with the Non-Proliferation Treaty meeting that just started, and joining us from Santa Marta, Colombia, where the fossil fuel phase-out conference is beginning, or there's a whole series of events going on down there that they can maybe explain to us. But we'll give everyone, we've got 3 or 4 speakers from Santa Marta and a couple more from here. We'll give everybody a chance to just sort of introduce a bit what's going on in the 2 places, and then we'll have a more of a general discussion about the prospects that these 2 treaties, the treaty that exists here in the US, in this meeting here in the US, and I'm sure we'll talk about the TPNW as well as the NPT, because that's where it's really happening. And then there's a possible treaty in formation, right, as we speak, down in Colombia, that would phase out fossil fuels. And so we're very excited to hear what the developments are there. But also to hear some realistic feedback of, we just had the first morning of the NPT review, the 11th review conference here in New York. And I'm sure my colleagues here will share some of the interventions that we heard this morning, which were not that surprising, but not that encouraging either. But maybe, and I don't know how far you've got down there with events that you can share, but we'll start with, who wants to start? Genevieve, you're all ready to get going. You want to just start and give us a little bit of an introduction to what's going on down there, and then the other 3 can join in. And Karen is also going to share from the Peace Boat perspective. So let me just introduce, Genevieve is with Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And I don't know if there's more WILF people at the conference, but you can maybe explain.
Yes, hello everyone. It's so nice to be here with you. I hope you can hear me okay. I am joining from the University of Magdalena, where there are some of the meetings that are part of this huge conference. WILF is so proud to be here with the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, advocating for a legally binding treaty that would phase out fossil fuels, and also bringing, a peace perspective and anti-militarist perspective. And I don't think I have to tell the people in this room how important it is that we also make the connection between fossil fuels, nuclear, both because of the existential threat to humanity and all species on the planet, but also just the tremendous overlaps between the impacts of fossil fuels and fossil fuel power, nuclear armed states, and more. The energy here in Santa Marta has been, I think, really amazing from my perspective. And I want to hear from others as well. But there's a lot of things going on. There's an academic conference that took place. There's been some civil society processes, and WILF, represented by me and also by our amazing section in Colombia, Limpal Colombia, has been really involved in the women and gender diversities sector. So there's different sectors that also kind of align with some of the constituencies under the UNFCCC and also other coalitions. And so we've been really advocating there for the treaty and also bringing in militarism, together all of the sectors, like all of the indigenous peoples groups, Afro-descendant groups, campesinos, women, youth, brought together and adopted together a People's Declaration for a rapid, equitable, and just transition. Apologies, there's a little bit of noise in the background. I'll just mute myself really briefly. We are in a live university as well with students who are also learning. So apologies for that. But together we launched a People's Declaration for rapid, equitable, and just transition. And it talks about the current context in our world of the war in Iran and Lebanon.
Don't worry, we can't hear the background very much.
Sincere apologies. It's
No,
right
don't
at the
worry, don't
time
worry.
that the that a class got out because yeah, we're all here, but there's also still classes going on. So anyway, we launched this People's Declaration, and it recognizes the current context in our world. It talks about sovereignty, peace, and global justice. It talks about demilitarization. It rejects false solutions. And the Women in Diversity's position paper was very clear about nuclear. And I was also asked to briefly talk by my colleague Ray Atchison from Reaching Critical Will, who kindly shared with me also some of the history and reminded me of some of the history of the TPNW process, which is so relevant for us here as we mobilize on all of these things and mobilize for a fossil fuel treaty. And some of which is like frustration with the nuclear armed state doublespeak, refusing to disarm, pursuing nuclear modernization while claiming to be in compliance with legal obligations, and the amazing work of pivoting towards a ban without the nuclear armed states. And that work that was required to build out coalitions, to get a diverse group of people together to build consensus, and that it was transnational, feminist, brought intersectional analysis, and centered communities that are most impacted and by nuclear harms, whether in Japan, of course, in the Pacific, indigenous communities throughout the world, and talking about reciprocity. And so one of our areas of advocacy here in Santa Marta, also with the treaty initiative, is a new paper that a joint paper between WILF and the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative called The Double Dividend: How Reducing Military Spending Could Finance a Global Just Transition. And so here we're trying to talk about the fact that although there's been a lot of proposals around discussions for just transition financing that are vital, such as debt cancellation and tax justice, we also have to look at how existing resources are spent and the ways in which the current allocation of resources are both diverting funds from climate justice, diverting funds from all of that, but also entrenching militarization, entrenching violence, impunity, and making it less possible to cooperate and to build trust and to basically have the world we want, including climate justice. And so we specifically call for reducing military spending and redirecting towards a global just transition fund under the Fossil Fuel Treaty framework, which could help provide the required financing while facilitating trust building, cooperation, and diplomacy, expanding resources for renewable energy development, worker retraining, community-led economic diversification, environmental remediation, and a broader systems change away from extractivism and structural violence. And so I think one final thing, which I'll reflect on that Ray also shared with me, is around the importance of changing the narrative around what is possible and what is realistic. We're talking about two things that have made our world the way it is today, fossil fuels and militarism and nuclear weapons, which have been central to colonialism, to imperialism. And this is not easy, and we're aware of that, but the moment we're living in, I think I'm noticing here in Santa Marta that many people are really willing to have that conversation. And I hope that will be the case. And I especially hope that in the ministerial that the states who are here will take that conversation seriously. So I'll leave it there. And apologies again for the energy of the university behind me. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you so much, Genevieve. The energy in front of the camera was outweighed the energy behind you, so don't worry. Great. Well, lots of really great themes there. Let's hear from the others that are down there. And I don't know, Maria or Amira, do you want to go? Who wants to go next?
Sure. Okay, so I'm stepping in for Amira, who is on another panel that is running over right now. But my name is Rachel. Yeah, yeah. My name is Rachel, and I work with Amira at the Fossil Fuel Treaty. I'm a global coordinator. And yeah, so for those of you who don't know much about the Fossil Fuel Treaty proposal, maybe just to quickly summarize what it is. Currently, in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement that sits under it, there's no mention of coal, oil, or gas, which, as we all know, is one of the main drivers of the climate crisis. They really focus on carbon emissions specifically, but there's not really an agreement that manages production of fossil fuels and what a managed, fair, fast, funded, feminist decline of fossil fuel production would look like. But there's a really urgent need to be reducing our fossil fuel production, both for climate goals. Fossil fuels are responsible for 86% of carbon emissions, and so we just need to manage fossil fuel production in order to meet our climate goals, but also because they are a key driver of interstate conflicts. I think it's something like 20 to 50% of interstate conflicts in the last few decades have been linked to fossil fuels. So they are an accelerator of conflict, a cause of conflict, a tool of war. We're seeing that right now in Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, the myriad ways that fossil fuels and conflict are linked. And they're responsible for substantial human rights violations near where fossil fuels are produced. In particular, we see a lot of like gendered violence and missing and murdered Indigenous women in areas near where fossil fuel production sits. There's health impacts that primarily impact Black and Brown communities globally. And so there's so many reasons that we need to deal with the issue of fossil fuel production itself. And so the Fossil Fuel Treaty is a proposal for how we would do that. In particular, we are calling for international cooperation to create binding international mechanisms that would end any new fossil fuel expansion, so no new projects, fair, fast, funded phase out of existing fossil fuel production, and a just transition that takes into account workers, but also frontline communities, countries that are economically dependent on fossil fuel production, and the link between fossil fuels and debt. So making sure that the transition is just on sort of like every level that we can. And in order to do that, we definitely need to make sure that all voices are at the table as we design what a fossil fuel treaty can and should look like, what types of mechanisms it should cover. And so the Santa Marta conference is a really exciting time to start having some of those conversations around specific proposals for what might end up in a fossil fuel treaty and sort of what are the principles that need to guide the negotiation of one. And so, we have 18 countries that have now endorsed the fossil fuel treaty, mostly Pacific and small island states, but also three fossil fuels, Timor-Leste, and Colombia. And one of the things that our researchers understood as they looked at past treaty negotiation efforts that have led to ambitious treaties, they looked at nuclear weapons treaties, but also the landmine ban. They showed that negotiations that take place outside of the UN system, and in particular, can prevent blocker nations from coming into the conversation and blocking a high level of ambition. Seems like the way that we would win the best possible fossil fuel treaty. And so started talking to those 18 participating nations about the idea of a series of outside of the UN diplomatic conferences where we could bring together a coalition of the willing or a coalition of doers, countries that are ready to start moving on fossil fuel production. And from those conversations came the idea for the Santa Marta conference, which is now being co-hosted by Colombia and the Netherlands.
Yeah.
And and so now there are, I think, nearly 60 countries that are gathered in Santa Marta to have conversations, not about negotiations of a fossil fuel treaty. The agenda for this week is much broader than that, because there's a lot of elements of fossil fuel production that need to be discussed. But 60 countries that are gathered to have a really clear, explicit conversation on the need for a transition from fossil fuels, which is more than we've managed in UN spaces so far. And so still very exciting. The three core pillars that they're talking about are economic dependence on fossil fuel production, supply and demand measures, and then the third pillar is international cooperation. And in that pillar, we are really trying to push for specifically for them to be talking about binding agreements, in particular fossil fuel treaty. And Tuvalu has already announced that they will host a second conference. And so between now and Tuvalu, we push for more countries to join the block of countries that are interested in negotiation of a fossil fuel treaty to ensure that this series of diplomatic conferences leads to a negotiation mandate. And so this third pillar in the Santa Marta conversation is the place where we really start to lay out the plan for how we get from here to a negotiation mandate. And then there is pretty extensive
I was just mad about
Yeah.
pre-meetings.
Please do.
That bit,
Yeah.
please, or a bit later.
That's what I was about to get into. So
Go for it.
No, go.
Your compliment. Sorry. I just wanted to add, I'm Liz Bernstein, also with the Fossil Fuel Treaty. It's wonderful to have this conversation. Thanks for making it happen. And worked on the landmine ban treaty, so many memories. And it's exciting to see new process start. But in addition to what Rachel was sharing, we did bring together the countries who have committed to the treaty. So we've had a series of pre-meetings before the conference Colombia and the Netherlands are hosting begins tomorrow. So we've met with participating nations. We've had a senior officials meeting where representatives from many of the countries who have endorsed the treaty already, as well as some observers who are interested in learning more and starting the process. And what's been exciting for us is to have some from from Africa. We've had participants from Ghana and Kenya, for example, and Malawi for the first time in these conversations, and Europe. And just today, there was a ministerial meeting. And again, as Rachel said, when Tuvalu announced that they would host the next conference, but also that they agreed together on some talking points. That they, as the governments who are participants already of the treaty, the nations, the 18 nations, of some common talking points that they would like to continue to raise in the conversations that are starting tomorrow. So it's really great to see some cohesion building and reflecting on my experience with landmine treaty, how important that is that the states are working together and with common goals, and also trying to talk with others and sort of prepare for in the larger forum to make sure that those commitments are heard. And there's a lot of exciting momentum, and I think there'll be some more coming out of that. We'll be able to share documents and such. We just finished literally an hour ago, so nothing is really ready to share yet from that particular ministerial meeting, but they will be forthcoming, and I'd love to share it with you, Tim, and then you could share with the others as well. Sorry, now go back. So that's all I wanted to add.
Yeah. So maybe the last thing that I'll say in terms of the methodology for the Santa Marta conference is that in addition to the really incredible People Summit declaration that Genevieve was talking about, there's also ways that those same chapters are being able to feed into the conversation in the high level segment of the Santa Marta conference. So the high level segment will be taking place the 28th and the 29th, and that is where the countries will be coming together to discuss those three themes that I mentioned earlier. And in the lead up to this conference, there was a period where each of the chapters were able to submit written submissions on each of those three pillars that were then synthesized by the Colombian government. And then they held virtual dialogues where groups were able to talk about those synthesized reports and add in any additional feedback that they wanted to feed into the process. And then now there is an assembly of the peoples that is happening, not to be confused with the People's Summit, where those chapters are coming together to finalize their submissions to the high level segment and choose representatives who will be able to speak to those submissions in the high level segment. And then additionally, civil society, indigenous peoples, trade workers, all of these different chapters that were included in the process, there will be organizations that will be able to attend the high level segment as observers. So there have been a number of ways that we've been able to feed into the process in the lead up.
Great. Well, before we move on, I just wanted to say that we did invite the representatives from all the 18 countries that have signed on to the fossil fuel treaty, and I don't know if anybody's here from any of those, but I had one apology from the Netherlands who said they would have liked to come, but it's their national day today apparently. So, but anyway, we're trying to build relations with them here in New York as well. So thank you for that. Liz and Rachel, and Maria and Karen, do you want to just fill in a bit more about from the peace boat perspective? So if you're not familiar with the peace boat, we'll find out now.
Karen, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. Hi everybody. I'm not actually in Santa Marta. I'm in Athens, Greece, which has got nothing to do with the conference. But as was mentioned before, it's been quite a long build up until this, and they've tried to make it as inclusive as possible. And unlike the UNFCCC processes, where you have to have observer status, it was open to everybody. And there was a whole series of written submissions, and then there was a whole series of online dialogues as well, divided by sectors. So Maria and I have been working as a team, and I've been involved in the process sort of before the conference, and Maria is now in Santa Marta for the part there. And it has been, we've been sort of focusing on trying to push for the recognition between the connection between fossil fuels and militarism. And working in the UNFCCC spaces, this has always been quite difficult. And, we're sort of working in this kind of echo chamber, and it's the same people, and we haven't really been getting very far. And for me personally, I've been quite pleasantly surprised, at least within the civil society. I mean, this is also as well a reflection of the times that we're living in, and it's so difficult. It would be impossible to ignore right now the huge connections with the landscape that we have now, and the wars that are going on, the connection. So, I mean, that might have also a massive impact, but it was, I mean, militarism in the People's Declaration, militarism is mentioned 23 times. There is has been really strongly recognised by this People's Declaration that so many different sectors have led into, the women and gender sector, and there's very strong emphasis on the connection between fossil fuels and militarism, and also in the NGO sector, which is sort of the catch-all for everybody that doesn't fit in the other sectors, it seems. So this has been quite encouraging. Obviously, this is civil society, and it's going to be a bit it's difficult to see, it's still to be seen whether or not how successfully that leads into the when the governments get together to talk. But I found that quite encouraging. And another aspect that has been quite encouraging is that the declaration also includes a rejection of nuclear energy as a false solution. And in the UNFCCC spaces, there has been increasingly, year upon year, lots of side events about promoting nuclear energy. There has been pavilions. I mean, nuclear energy is really growing as a lobby. And at least in the sort of civil society discussions and in the declaration and in the sectors that I've seen so far, there is a firm rejection of nuclear energy as a transition or as a solution. It's the false solution. I personally would have liked to have seen a bit more about why it's rejected and the connections between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, and the military aspect, and also the key fact that it's extractive. So I would have liked a bit more detail there, but it's in there. And it's also, I think, there has been another sort of comparison with the nuclear weapons aspect. Is I think there is also a good, strong recognition of the impact that the fossil fuel industry has on communities, and there's been a lot of repetition about harm, especially Indigenous communities and marginalized communities. And this is kind of where we see the connection with the nuclear cycle, because both fossil fuels and the nuclear cycle are both extractive in their nature, and they are impacting on the similar communities are suffering in very similar ways. I don't want to sort of keep on, because a lot of what I was going to say has already been covered, so I don't think I need to repeat it. Maria, do you want to hand to you to sort of fill a bit more about what's been going on in Santa Marta?
Sure. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, everyone. First, I want to start that as a Colombian, it's an honor to have these kind of conversations here. So it's like seeing the diversity that is been taking place is incredible. Seeing Indigenous groups, women groups, I think it really shows diversity. I think that in that sense, we also have seen a challenge that we don't have enough representation from Africa and Asia because there were some problems with the visas. So I think it's a shame that we don't have those conversations here, because that's really interesting, especially due to important conversations about like ancestral knowledge and also science into these conversations. So I think it's a shame that this is not happening. But even though we've been having a great representation from the area, from the continent, and I think as my colleague said before, like the conversations online were also very important, because I think it's been a very participatory process. The conversations previous the conferences, then the People Summit, that it was during 3 days, then now the Assembly of the People. So it's very confusing because there's so many things happening, and now the high level forum. But I think in those conversations, I just want to highlight a few things that we think they're being interesting, and it can be very well connected to NPT. It's also how we're talking about just not an energy transition. We're been addressing more structural kind of issues, included inequality, colonial legacies, and militarism. So I think those conversations are interesting, because when people think about the transition, it's not just energy. So it's been really, the conversations have been really focusing in community building. A lot of conversations about repair, like repairment with the communities. So even thinking about the damage that it has been done. So how we kind of address that as an important issue as well. Also, I think it's very interesting how it's been pointing in the way that it's not just an environmental crisis, it's a human crisis. So I think in that sense, recognizing and talking about human rights with different perspectives has been really interesting. And I think also Rachel just mentioned the 3 pillars that have been discussed here in terms of non-proliferation, cooperation, and all the transition. So I think it's very interesting to see what's going to happen now, because like after the conversations and after the declaration, we've been working really hard to put this into words and try to put also the words militarism, nuclear into the documents. So it's clear that our position connecting with conflict, peace, and anti-militarism is there. So I think we achieve, I think is there. But I think it's like, it doesn't depend on us what's going to happen after. I think we're just looking forward to see how this document and how all this process built by civil society can take to the last level. We see a lot of pressure. We see a lot of participation. So it's really good to see it. We're just really, we have big expectations of what will happen next. So how the governments are going to be taking these as laws. And that's also part of the conversation, because what people are saying here is not just about talking, it's about doing. So people have been sharing also good practices and solutions. And I think the conversation should be also kind of like going to that direction. What are the solutions that we can share worldwide, and what is happening that is working well, so we can just move forward to more action. So yeah, that's kind of like the perspective from here, from Santa Marta.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much, all 5 of you. And I just wanted to, for the people that are in the room here, they did put the People's Declaration in the chat. So we'll circulate that to everybody that signed up, so you can also have that copy. And before we move on to our 2 speakers from here, I just wanted to highlight a couple things. One, the nuclear energy issue and the nuclear energy lobby is right here in New York at the NPT. I mean, you can't walk to the meeting without passing all these, you know, pro nuclear power stalls and displays and so on. So that's something that is constantly here, as you know, as part of the NPT framework. So it's very difficult. But the other thing I just wanted to flag, several of you were talking about, I mean, the links between the fossil fuel and the nuclear weapons are huge. And one of them that I think you all know implicitly, but it didn't mention, is the corporations that are responsible for us being in this situation on both sides. I mean, these corporations are so powerful, and they have so much influence, especially in this country, in the US, that's why we need these treaties, to really put the pressure on these companies. So anyway, that's a really great overview. We'll have a chance to have more discussion and questions. But first, let's hear from Anduin DeVos from Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, and then from Seth Sheldon from ICAN, just a little bit of a perspective from what's going on here in New York for you guys. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. And thank you all for being here. I'm so thrilled to hear from the ground in Santa Marta. The energy there seems very different in a very good way as compared to what we're dealing with here in New York with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Can you all hear me? Okay, louder. Anyway, as Tim introduced, I'm with the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. I'm also with the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And both these organizations like Peace Boat, like WILPF, and many others in the nuclear space share common concerns over what we call the twin existential threats of nuclear and climate. And we also have a history of extending those concerns to nuclear energy, especially as a false solution to the climate crisis and in concerns around the humanitarian risks. I'm also the coordinator with Timon of the Warheads to Windmills Coalition, which aims to break out of these peace versus climate silos to bring these movements together. I think that's a real challenge, as Karen was referencing in these movements. But this is the third event we've held on the sidelines of disarmament movements, of disarmament fora, linking first in 2023 to the COP28, where we had a great discussion. And then last year with the event hosted by the missions of Tuvalu and Vanuatu, where we looked at lessons from the TPNW processes for the fossil fuel treaty going forward. And I do want to reflect on how much I think growth we have seen in those last 3 years, even in breaking down those silos, in making those militarism connections to climate, and all of these things. I think keeping these conversations active is really important. It's very easy to work on these issues in silos, but again, increasingly we're seeing these connections being made and strengthened, even outside of our like campaigner activism or in the general public. I think a lot of people are seeing climate as a security issue more. They're seeing the economic priorities around the world, where we're seeing deprioritizing of sustainability and the environment, coupled with increased military and nuclear weapons spending, continued conflicts over oil, which has been mentioned, and the environmental costs of nuclear weapons and war in general, especially. I think Rachel also mentioned that, as we're seeing the destruction around the world and radiological risks in Iran and other conflict zones. And then there's also the shared experiences from the frontline and affected communities, who we know in large part are many of the same communities that have faced the brunt of both climate and nuclear. So I just want to speak a little broadly about hope and prospects for a nuclear and fossil-free future, and then I'm really looking forward to what discussion we can have to bring this forward. But when we're talking about prospects for a nuclear and fossil-free future, I think it's really tricky, as we're here on the first day of the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. And obviously a lot is incredibly up in the air. We've only had the first morning session, but there's already a lot of calling out of lack of progress on disarmament obligations, and a lot of states citing various reasons why they're feeling the treaty is being undermined and feeling this frustration on lack of progress and what have you. I obviously hope to see a lot more progress as the conference continues from the nuclear weapon states towards those Article 6 obligations to disarm and to engage constructively with the TPNW, but I'm not necessarily hopeful in that front. But I also know that these moments of frustration and blockage in the system are really what give the opportunity to build something new, as you're doing with this summit in Santa Marta, and as so many of us are trying to build new around the NPT. The lack of outcome at the 2015 RevCon was really the impetus to create the TPNW, which opened up the framework to help achieve the NPT's goals of disarmament. And unfortunately, 11 years later, we're 11 years since the 2015 review conference, we're seeing that the NPT is in danger of still remaining stalled. But we're seeing this contrast where, out of that frustration, we have this new mechanism, the TPNW, which has reached the growing global majority. And I'm sure Seth will speak more specifically on that. But I think there's a lot of progress when we're feeling these frustration with the systems and creating these new structures to kind of bring us in the direction that we want to go, that the global majority wants to go, that is more just and sustainable for the world. And I just think there's a lot of parallels in between our two movements in terms of even just the structures of why we're having to do this and how we're going about it. And I think I'll just leave it there unless I take on, and I'm looking forward to discussion.
Thanks. Okay, Seth, take it away.
Sure. Okay, I'll try it. Thank you, Tim. I'm Warheads, the Windmills, and all 5 of you in Santa Marta, well, in Greece, Santa Marta and Greece, but in general, working on the treaty. It's exciting to hear what's going on there, and it is a great opportunity to sort of find synergies, because of course people in our communities have been talking all the time and for decades that, you know, about the twin existential threats, as Anduin's talking about, but there's so few efforts, I think, to connect the movements for you know, working together to make progress. And I think you know, and also it's great to hear you, Anduin, talk about some of the efforts to break the silos, because yeah, I mean, the climate risks of nuclear weapons and the security risks of the climate crisis are, you know, those 2 sides of the same coin, I guess, that everyone's always been talking about, but we have been struggling to advance solutions for. Except that we do have good news on our side. We're not hearing about it on this first day of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons Conference as much, but what I could perhaps talk about too is the work that we've managed to advance to bring an antidote to the dynamics that we're seeing at the NPT. So yeah, I'm with ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. We are a global coalition of, today it's more than 700 NGOs in 111 countries that are all working to stigmatize, prohibit, and eliminate nuclear weapons. And I guess many of us are familiar at some level with the trajectory of how we got to the treaty, and also the trajectory of initiatives that came before it, like Liz was talking about, the working on, you know, was it on the Mine Ban Treaty? And yeah, so that's one of our models for how we made progress with the TPNW and the humanitarian initiative, the humanitarian shift, as we call it, which could be, I think, and probably is, one good lesson for those working on initiatives to bring about these kind of prohibitions that are so needed to advance human development and preserve humanity to begin with. But yeah, what to offer that's actually helpful? I was thinking maybe in thinking about the analogies of our circumstances and our efforts, which of course have many distinctions as well. But you know, one broad stroke similarity, of course, is that that much as Anduin was saying, the TPNW made its progress after the frustrations of a failed review conference at the NPT in 2015, and has been a reaction to the stalemate under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It seems that some of your energy is driven from what the status quo left out, right? In terms of like UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. And so in one way, it can be seen as, you know, pitched as like a revolt. But in another way, it's an effort to supplement the intentions of what people had all along and to support an initiative and complement efforts that came about. And you know, that the NPT was born in 1968 in a very different circumstance than we have today. And so it makes sense that not everyone had the foresight to find the full path out of the problem. And you know, we hear everyone talking about in that room, like they give their general debate statements, and it's just like, you know, they've been giving the same statement for decades, honestly, reading their making these statements that are totally divorced from the current realities of the time. And they talk about the NPT as the cornerstone of the nuclear, you know, the nuclear legal regime, basically. And I think, you know, those of us working on this treaty on the TPNW can certainly say, you know, we can accept that it may be a cornerstone, but you don't build a house just by laying a cornerstone and then like say, oh, this looks good. Let's you know, move in the couch. And so, you know, we see the complementary efforts that we're bringing about as building a keystone or a capstone to the house that people built decades ago. And I think that's been our framing. At a certain point, though, you realize that those who are frustrating the efforts are doing it, and Tim had talked about the corporate interests that are, you know, undergirding the resistance to what we're doing. And you know that they're ultimately, of course, not acting in good faith, and that they don't have an interest in advancing what even if they've agreed to it, you know, even if some of these countries have signed on to commitments in the NPT, they don't actually care to see it through. And so perhaps that's an analogy that, you know, we're pitching everything as bringing about the ultimate goal of the efforts that were initiated by people and countries that were, you know, building on the frameworks they built, but we know that they actually didn't mean it. And that they didn't certainly build a structure that's going to bring it all about. And so we have to sort of keep both viewpoints in mind, I think, all the time, and where both of those have both of those perspectives at the ready. And I think that, you know, I mean, when Genevieve was talking about what's happening there and saying that it's key to those of you working in Santa Marta to frame everything in the reality of the current context of like what is happening in the world. And I think that's where, you know, where our framing in this month is coming from as well. Because if you, you know, go into the NPT meetings, what you're seeing is, as I said, people making these statements that they make all the time, as if the circumstances and realities haven't changed so drastically in the last review cycle of the NPT, the last 5 years, where, you know, and we see how divorced what they're doing is from reality. And I think that there's something that's really important about the TPNW process that is meant to reframe just that. And that is, I think, the fact that if we are, as civil society, as experts, and as affected communities, in the dominant paradigm, we are kept so far away from the process, as a procedural matter. And I mean, those of us coming from the first 3 hours of the NPT, of 120 hours, by the way, I've calculated, we're just about 2% into the process. You know, we are sat in the 4th floor balcony of the GA hall, so far away from where the delegates are meeting, and physically separated from the process in a way that, you know, by itself may or may not be significant, but it is significant in the process and the reality of the result as well. And one of the things that the TPNW did so progressively, and that perhaps I would expect everyone has their eye on there too, is about inclusion and whose voices are being centered. And the very specifics of that matter. And a lot of certainly your state diplomats will have some experience with this as well. But, you know, because in all of these processes, it can be difficult to even know sometimes, like, what's the most progressive process to look at as a model for procedural issues? And for us, you know, we managed, it's certainly in the nuclear space, the most progressive treaty procedurally. Like ICAN is a permanent observer to the treaty under the rules of procedure. And it means that civil society has an opportunity to speak throughout the meetings, like both the meetings that are taking forward in the intersessional processes, but also in the actual, you know, meetings of states parties and the review conference, and to help elevate the voices of experts that have been so excluded from so many of these processes to date. And the best experts of all, of course, are those who are affected by the harms that we're trying to correct. So the people, you know, the survivors of nuclear weapons use and testing. And it becomes more than a matter of procedure, of course, in ways that are evident when you're in the meetings, because you can see how that level of access and forcing states to engage with these perspectives does affect the results. They have to negotiate with us on some level. It's not the same. I mean, we're not states, we're not governments that get to vote, but I think it's been, I think, so markedly different from what we're seeing in the NPT in such a useful way. And I think that could be perhaps a good lesson procedurally. And yeah, I guess there's one other point I was going to make about I guess the other parallel too, in terms that's perhaps useful is how I think like to date, I defer to you as those who are working more on the climate issue, but I guess from what I observe, there is a similar framing to how the energy discussion is always framed in terms of the development needs of particular states. And you're working with a lot of the smaller states that have advanced that argument historically. That's the struggle they've had. It's so unfair, of course, for those states that have, from a lot of perspectives, from those states that have not enjoyed the benefits of like industrial advancement to now be told that like they have to take forward the limitations, right? And I think that is one thing that has been a crucial lesson perhaps of our move, like the work being done on the TPNW too, again, building off the humanitarian disarmament movement more generally, to reframe the question about state security and what's happening within borders to one that is more holistically aware of how your own citizens are going to continue to suffer if this is the only process forward, is to continue to think that way, and we have to find a way to have a mechanism that recognizes that human security and hopefully ecological security matters more than some kind of privilege that's enjoyed only by people within your borders. That's so competitive in nature, and so that too is, I think, by centering the people who are affected is the best way to get there. Like really having the people telling the stories about how their own community is affected by, in our case, by nuclear weapons use and testing, but and development, I should say too. But but I guess perhaps could be and probably is a similar strategy for those who are trying to make governments listen to the rationale of those advancing fossil fuel, ending fossil fuels as well. Okay, maybe I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, that was great. Thanks, Seth. I do want to have a conversation. We've got about 20 more minutes, and I just want to open it up by asking our friends down in Colombia. I know some of you have been at the COP meetings. I don't know if anybody here has been at any of the COPs, but maybe you could just say, you were talking about the energy and the feeling. I mean, Seth was describing the difference between the TPNW meetings and the NPT, which we're in right now, where we do have some say, but it's nothing compared to the interaction and the involvement and the participation that we have in the TPNW. And I just wonder if there's something similar that you sense that there's a possibility of being more involved in the conversation I guess it only starts tomorrow, right? So you don't know, but maybe you can just start off with some sense of that. Or not. Anybody feel?
Karen was up today.
Karen, do you want to go or?
If you, I'm happy for you to go first. Go.
Yeah, so I was at COP in Brazil and then now here at Santa Marta, and I think that there are ways that civil society and Indigenous peoples and frontline communities and others are really leading on ambition in the COP process, and also it is such a hard-won fight to be included at that table. the gains that we have made so far of the ways that they're included as constituencies, and it's like a very bureaucratic accreditation system, and so I guess just to say that like the ways that they have been able to engage have been quite hard won, and with that hard won engagement, they have managed to push so much within that space. And there are so many fossil fuel lobbyists who go to COP every year and are invited into the rooms that we are like banging on the doors to get into. And so yeah, the influence in those spaces is sort of as much from the blocker nations and from the fossil fuel industry. And I think that, it's really great that there are side events in the green zone and other places of participation, but I find that they also end up being places where we are presenting at each other and not necessarily like in conversation with the delegations that are in the actual COP process making the decisions. And so I think it's been interesting to be at this conference where I've only been to like one panel so far. And I found that a lot more of the spaces that we've created together in Santa Marta have been conversations like this, have been the process of co-creation of the People's Declaration and the co-creation of the submissions that are going into it. And so it's been a space where we are working together to figure out how to influence this process. And then because it's a process that's being created from scratch, it's not a COP process, it's not a pre-existing UN conference, or it's a space that Colombia and the Netherlands have been creating from scratch, and there's been really huge coordinated efforts to push on what that looks like. And it hasn't been perfect, it wasn't smooth. I think everyone here would agree it's been a bit confusing at times. But on the other hand, like this got announced in November, and we managed to, in this short period of time, really push for how we wanted to have a seat at this table. And now here we are in Santa Marta, and we're in so many of these different spaces able to try to influence the process. And I think that looking to Tuvalu, there's even more opportunities to really be naming how we want to be engaged in this process moving forward. And because it's something that is being built outside of the sort of pre-existing spaces, there's a chance to be a bit more experimental, to push things a little bit further, to name exactly how we want to be at the table or how we want the table to be built in the first place, rather than really fighting each other for like the one spare seat that isn't being sat in by fossil fuel lobbyists. And so I think that it feels like there's energy here that it's messy, but it is a process of co-creation that is happening, and that's always going to be a bit messy, but it also feels like there's opportunities to push further than there have been in other spaces. So yeah, I would say that's my reflections from Bella to Santa Marta.
Did you want to add something?
I'm not in Santa Marta, but I have been involved in the process and I've been going to COP since I don't know, the last 10 years, and it was a huge difference. I mean, just the fact that in the COPs in the UNFCCC process, civil society are observers, so and even to become an observer currently, because of UN cuts in UN funding, there's about 2-year wait list before, if you apply for an application to be an observer, it's going to take about 2 years before you get that status. So I mean, even the barriers that level to get over job, and then the whole process is incredibly difficult to get involved in anything, which is completely different to the Santa Marta process, where there was an absolutely open call. You didn't have to have any ECOSOC status. You didn't have to have any anybody, any organization could apply to be involved in the process. And as you mentioned, that at COPs there is a huge influx of fossil fuel lobbyists. I think in the last COP they would have had, if they were compared to a country, they would have had one of the largest delegations. But there was, for the Santa Marta process, there was a screening, and fossil fuel lobbyists were quite rightly excluded from the Santa Marta process from the very beginning. So that is a completely different thing. And there is a lot of discussions going on at the same time as this kind of the Santa Marta process is going on about the need for the drastic need for reform of the UNFCCC. And a lot of the same folks that I'm working with within the UNFCCC, for example, the Women and Gender constituency, where I'm leading the Peace and Demilitarization group, have also been involved in the Santa Marta process. And it's just been completely different. The way that kind of people got the Colombian government, although it wasn't a perfect process, the fact that they are online dialogues that civil society was invited to participate in, and these anybody could join at all, so long as you put the written submission in, and then you're invited. You took part in this process. Anybody could be a part of them, and they were co-facilitated by somebody from the Colombian government and then someone from civil society, which in our case was the Women and Gender constituency. Completely different to where in the UNFCCC process we can barely even get in the room as an observer, and we're not even allowed to speak. I mean, completely different. Maybe I'm just really jaded by the COP conferences year after year, but it's been truly depressing to be at them and quite different to be involved in the processes in Santa Marta. So we do need to reform the UNFCCC, absolutely, but it's also good at the same space. The NPT is still continuing and needs change there, but at the same time the TPNW exists, and the fossil fuel treaty process will also fossil fuel treaty will also exist, and we can sort of push on both fronts in the climate space as well.
Yeah. Are there other comments or questions? I mean, I think one of the great parallels. I mean, Seth was talking about the trajectory that led to the TPNW, and one of the really important steps was the series of humanitarian consequences conferences, which kind of parallels what you're doing in Santa Marta. That led up to. I mean, we couldn't even talk about a treaty before that. It was taboo. We already have the NPT. You can't talk about another treaty, but you can have these conferences and talk about changing the framework and changing the whole conversation. And that was so effective in setting the ball rolling. So I hope that that's what's going to happen there too. But yeah, Anthony.
First of all, thank you very much. It's been a delight to feel your commitment and to see your smiling faces. Wow, thank you for this. I'm an associate member of Veterans for Peace, and you all get it, that militarism has been our largest consumer around the planet. You all know that. You've stated it in what you've said. So they're coming out evidently with another report soon, but they've been pushing this idea of the consumerism of our militarism for a long time. So glad to hear that's in the consciousness. I was wondering, since Francesca Albanese's report last June, another great woman leader, she's really tied in the genocide and the apartheid with these corporations that are profiting from this. So I'm wondering, I know your conference is about to begin, but I'm wondering if that's going to be genocide, apartheid, all our wars, how much you'll be able to bring that into this conference, tie it in. I know we're trying to tie that situation of genocide into our nuclear weapon. They're the same companies. That's what happens when you read Francesca's report. You realize these are the same profiteers. So yeah, good luck. I just want to thank you, and was wondering if that word genocide is able to be used down there. I think you're in Colombia, so they're probably very much so.
Anybody want to respond to that?
I can speak briefly to that, which is to say, yes, I think that there has been a very active discussion about militarism, about imperialism, about the genocide, and also about the war on Iran, for sure, and Venezuela, as I think also Rachel was saying. And we're also trying to lift that up. That's, I think, also part of our advocacy, very much so. And I'll speak briefly also to the report, because I think I was thinking about what Seth was sharing about how, like, really thinking about what was the intention all along. And, the UN since its founding, since the UN Charter, Article 26, and with so many commitments over the years, has talked about military spending, has talked about militarization, and said that that is a founding goal of this institution. And so that's also something we tried to map out in the report. Like we map out climate finance needs, specifically just transition financing, while also recognizing that it is impossible to put a specific price on the loss of ecosystems, on the loss of lives, on the loss of cultures, of communities. But we mapped that against military spending and also certainly grounded it, I think, in that global context, particularly with the past few years. And I also want to name that the Secretary General's report on the impact of military spending on sustainable development is also a very valuable resource in this regard, with a lot of great data that we certainly drew from. But I think it was really great to think about this also within the context of a fossil fuel treaty, what a global just transition fund could do, also to try to repair, and while recognizing that those interlinkages between the fossil fuel order, the militarized order, colonial legacies, current imperial structures, and aggression that's only increasing. So I would say definitely yes, that has been really central to the conversation, and at least we're trying to make it more so. The leadership of Colombia on this has really been amazing. And tomorrow we have an event to launch the report, and part of the event is so with those of us who are on this call, and also with others, for example, the energy embargo for Palestine, the Women's Environment and Development Organization. So we're really excited to have a broader conversation about that and about a feminist just transition.
Thank you. Great. David Gibson had a comment in the chat. I don't know if he wants to say something. You're welcome to join in, David.
Sure, thanks. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Good. So I'm in the hallway. It's kind of noisy. Yeah, just listening to all this, I mean, I understand it, and my head hurts trying to follow it all. And I think our success depends on the support of mass support. What we really need is a mass movement, kind of akin to what's going on here in the United States with the No Kings movements, wed to the nuclear freeze campaign that we all remember and love. We need to be getting out into the streets, and we need some sort of central, easy to understand focus that people can get behind, and have these things sustainably at various high visible times, like the COP conferences and the upcoming I don't know what you want to call it, celebration, if you want to call it that, of the 150th, the declaration. When we can get a lot of people out there and press politically to get the seat at the table that we're having a hard time getting. I mean, I don't know if that resonates with people in this room. I'm an organizer. I want to see people in the streets because that's what moves the needle ultimately.
Anybody want to comment on that? Yeah,
let me say one more thing. I've been asking around. I saw a talk by David Cartwright recently, who you all may remember, who was talking about discussions happening in Washington about a return to nuclear disarmament. And there was some sort of centralized theme that they were talking about. And since that conference that I saw him at, I haven't been able to find anybody who can tell me if there's those kinds of discussions happening among groups in DC. And if anybody can clue me in on that, that'd be great, because it seems to have vanished into thin air.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
So if anyone wants to respond to David, go ahead. This is a separate topic, a separate question I have for the panelists.
Yeah, I was just going to say quickly, I definitely agree that we need mass support. And I think it's, our role as organizers to do, earlier someone used the word stigmatize. And I think that is a really great way of thinking about what we need to be doing right now, is like not just educating people on educating people on carbon emissions, for instance, in the climate space. Like we don't really I don't know that mass education about carbon emissions is necessarily going to translate into a movement that will end these like really harmful systems of imperialism, let's say. And so I think that like in using moments like Santa Marta that exists, but then also like moments right now where war is making oil more expensive and it is like potentially leading to US troops on the ground. Like now is a moment to stigmatize the role of fossil fuels in the climate crisis, in our daily lives, in militarism, et cetera. And so I think, yeah, on the one hand, I think that, yeah, those types of mass movements are necessary. And I think that these are moments, I think, especially like these types of connections between our two movements and the spaces that we've created on the side of the Santa Marta conference to talk amongst ourselves are the times where we can really get coordinated on what our demands and what our messages are, because we also know that mass mobilizations are more effective when they have really clear asks and in particular like proposals, like actual actionable asks for governments to do.
I'm gonna let you. I mean, there's some more comments in the chat about ideas for that. We've only got 5 more minutes.
Can I speak back to that real quick?
No, let's move on because we've only got 5 minutes.
Okay.
There's some other responses to you in the chat if you see them. I don't know.
I also just wanted to add one thing to what Rachel said about both questions, about the previous question about Palestine and the movement building question. Kind of, there's an example here with the collaboration with the flotilla, Palestine flotilla that has come on ships and has demanded fossil fuel treaty, and they came here. So again, together, movements working together, but also in the streets. As today, they blocked the port where there have been coal exports going out. So just kind of wanted to bring that into the conversation. Over to you.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for mentioning that, Liz. That's so incredibly hopeful. My name's Beth Blissman. I represent the Loretto community here at the United Nations Sisters of Loretto and co-members. We're a Catholic-based organization with an office right across the hallway from WILP. So cheers to you, Genevieve. Thank you for being there and representing the whole church center. And my question for you is, we're in a time when also our minds are being hacked in the information ecosystem, right? We've lost what Maria Ressa calls information integrity because these corporations you were referring to, Tim, have also captured the corporate media, right? So we don't go to the same places for truth that we used to. We don't have a shared sense of what truth is and where we go to find that. So in that setting, one of the places, ironically, we see people turning to or perhaps turning back to is faith-based organizations, ironically, the Catholic Church. More people are joining than in a long time, perhaps because there is a decent ethical stance coming from our Pope against war, against nuclear weapons, supportive of migrants. So, certainly not perfect by any means, but there's a strong moral, ethical voice. So I'm just curious what you're seeing both in the lead up to the conference happening and on the ground in Santa Marta. I just saw in my email, there was a press release that just came out from that interfaith group, Faiths for a Fossil Fuel-Free Future. Too many Fs, lots of Fs in that organization. But what are your thoughts about the potential and power of faith-based organizing, especially interfaith-based organizing?
Anybody can answer that?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting, like from the Latin American perspective, understanding interfaith as a spiritual approach. And I think also the different groups have been talking about how the spiritual is faith and is hope, but it also how those like maybe more spiritual groups in different currents are also bringing different perspective, also combining with science. So there's a lot of conversations on how to embrace the traditional knowledge with the traditional knowledge from communities, not necessarily interfaith, but they call it spiritual here. That was the name of the group. And it was very interesting to also hear the different approaches into that and how they're thinking about like, and it was beautiful to hear it yesterday. They say we're here because we have faith in what's going to happen. But we definitely need to hear from different spiritual leaders. They even brought different leaders that represent indigenous communities from different places in Latin America. They have rituals and they have spaces also to understand their connection to the land, but also like their connection to nature.
Right.
Also, little point that they nominated at the faith group nominated 4 representatives to go to the high level segments tomorrow, and all 4 are women in the faith community.
Okay. Well, I think what we're all talking about is, whether it's spiritual faith, you were contrasting that our belief that we can change, that we can actually do this, that it's possible to build a world that is free of nuclear weapons and fossil fuels and all the other things that are destroying the planet, that it's not just what's possible and what's doable, or you said realistic. We hear that kind of language all the time. We heard it this morning over and over again here at the NPT. You're all dreaming about something that's not possible. We're the realists here. We're going to talk about what we can actually achieve, and we all know that that's not true. We've got to create the world that we want, and we're doing that. And the TPNW and the Fossil Fuel Treaty are ways forward. I mean, they're showing what's possible, and we're not there yet. But that's our goal. That's our vision. And we're out of time, but yeah.
I think there's some encouraging things that I picked up over the past 2 weeks that I just wanted to share to everybody who's here and for the people who have spoken. It's been quite encouraging to hear everybody. My name's Eileen Krukowski. I'm on the board for WILF and membership development. What I'm hearing a lot is that groups are calling on mayors to sign on to ICAN. What I'm hearing here and other places hear you. Groups in the US are finding and supporting female leaders. In fact, gaining money as getting grants to say, hey, we want women in these positions, and they're getting the money and backed to support female leaders who are for peace, who are for the progressive attitudes. Third thing, since President Trump announced the annihilation of Iran, a lot of people are pausing and thinking twice about our ethics. I've heard that 3 times since I've just come here. And they are pausing even about the money going to support the Middle East as it is. Communities are also getting together more just to support each other because they're losing their jobs, they're losing their houses. I'm talking about a lot of experience in Boston. And Medicare, they're losing that. And I recently talked with a Wilfer who wrote a book on the environment. Her name is Maya Ballas, M-A-I-A-B-A-L-L-I-S. She basically is a farmer that got the solar panels that are using organics. But her point is she looked at all the newest things on the block, including something that Microsoft leader Gates is interested in because they called her back.
We gotta
and the
finish.
thing is, there is a kind of a fertilizer based on humus, and a tree. If you combine the two, you can make water in the desert. Check her out. Her name is Maya Ballas.
Okay.
She's getting nothing for her book, by the way.
Okay,
Nothing.
Maya Ballas, got that. Well, thank you. Thanks, Eileen. Thanks everybody. As Edwin said, this is the 3rd time we've tried to make these links, and we'll keep doing it. This is just the we're not solving it all today. We're just part of a process. We wish you all the very best over there in Santa Marta. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for organizing this.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thanks,
for
everybody.
organizing.
Are we
Thank
doing
you.
a photo? I see you brought a.
Yeah, we got the banner. Yeah, let's do a photo. Can you stay on the screen for a minute? And
Will
we'll,
we get some assistance to take a
yeah,
photo?
we'll get somebody to, we'll just hold up our, come on, let's just get a picture.
Well, let me get my camera out too.
Can you wanna get the group,
Yeah, if we can. Oh, stop recording, but we don't wanna lose them. You're still there. You're awfully big on this giant screen. Do you remember